Merit. The title is Gabriel Garcia Márquez and the Solitude of Latin America with Professor Alejandro Murguia, Chair of Latino-Latina Studies at San Francisco State University. My name is Abby Bogomolny, faculty in the English department. We hope that you will join us for our other Work of Literary Merit events honoring 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Márquez. Tomorrow, we will have an interdisciplinary bilingual reading of excerpts from the novel here in Newman from 5 to 6 p.m. Reading will be SRJC faculty Susanna Ackerman and Michael Hale, Student Affairs Officer Erica Hernandez, and EOPS Counselor Rafael Vasquez. Then, on April 4th at noon, we will host Professor Persis Karim of San Jose State University English Department and Comparative Lit. She will discuss History's Shadow and El Realismo Mágico in 100 Years of Solitude. And finally, on Tuesday, April 5th, from 5 to 6 p.m., Dr. Lauren Nahas, SRJC English Department faculty, will discuss social protest in 100 Years of Solitude. For the faculty present, I hope you will bring your classes, and our WOLM events are available for faculty flex credit. So, it is my pleasure to introduce Alejandro Guillermo Murguia, Professor of Latina Studies at San Francisco State University and current Poet Laureate of San Francisco. He is a two-time winner of the American Book Award for This War Called Love, 9 Stories, and Southern Front. His memoir, The Medicine of Memory, has been nominated for the Victor Turner Prize in ethnographic writing. He was also a founding member and the first director of the Mission Cultural Center in San Francisco. He has several other books of verse to his name, the latest of which is Stray Poems. I invited Alejandro to speak with us as a poet because I thought no one less than a poet should discuss the beautifully rich writing of Gabriel Garcia Márquez. Please welcome Alejandro Murguia.
Thank you, Abby, for that very generous introduction. But she forgot to mention that I also make really good breakfast burritos. And sometimes that's the most important part of my CV. Nearly 50 years ago, a roving and nostalgic Colombian, exiled in Mexico City, published a book on which he had been working on with unrelenting discipline for 16 months, and which was destined to enrich not just literature, but the hopes of a continent too long abandoned to misfortune, misinterpretations, and the vagaries of foreign powers. And I'm referring, of course, to Cien Años de Soledad. And before I go, any further, I want to thank Santa Rosa Junior College, and especially Abby Bogomolny, who risked her academic career by inviting me here today to share these thoughts. Voy a usar la palabra soledad lo más posible en vez de la traducción, porque me parece que la palabra soledad tiene muchos más sentidos que en el inglés, y también se puede referir, por ejemplo, a un nombre, el nombre Soledad, que se repite muchas veces en mi familia, incluso el nombre de mi mamá. And so for those of you that are linguistically challenged, what I said was, I hope the Warriors continue to win this season. And in today's remarks, I want to reference not just Cien Años de Soledad, but actually, even more so, I want to reference the speech that Gabriel Garcia Márquez made in 1982 in Stockholm when he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, and his talk that historic day was in fact titled The Solitude of Latin America, which is the title that I adapted for today's reflections. So I want to mix a little bit of the characters and some of the events that happen in that fabulous book with his speech and try to bring it up to date because his thoughts 35 years ago still resonate, I think, amongst Latin Americans and throughout this continent. And at the same time, I hope if I have enough time to close by offering a few remarks about California and California's link to Latin America and how, just like in the struggle to express the reality of Latin America, it took writers like Gabriel Garcia Márquez to develop or create almost a new method of narration to be able to capture not just the beauty and the pain and the history of Latin America, but what it means to be a Latin American at that time in the 20th century. But now that we live in the 21st century, I think it's important to reflect on his hopes that day when he delivered that speech in Stockholm. I want to start by referencing that although the world since 1982 has grown so much closer, for example, with the technology of satellites, with the technology of cell phones, where any one of you can pick up a cell phone and talk to someone halfway around the world. And although that technology has expanded our communication, it seems to me, and I don't think I'm wrong, that the perception of Latin America that Gabriel Garcia Márquez was talking about back then still has not changed. We still, especially in the United States, and especially the politicians of our time, still refuse to look at Latin America with the eyes of Latin Americans. We are still looked upon as strangers, as if instead of using the technology of today, those that observe us are using the telescope of Christopher Columbus to define who we are. And so one of the things that Gabriel Garcia Márquez mentions, and you'll have to excuse me if sometimes I refer to him as Gabo in a more personal tone, not because I was a friend of his or knew him intimately, but just to speed up the narrative a little bit. But one of the things that he points out is one of the reasons that the Western world does not understand Latin America is because the Western world looks at Latin America through its own eyes, expecting to see not Latin America, not that reality, right? But expecting to see a reflection of themselves, which by its very nature is absurd because we are not Westerners in that sense. And in fact, to live in Latin America, to be a Latin American, to live in California, in fact, is to accept a dual reality, the reality of our continent that is also mixed with the reality of the rest of the Western world. And before I go any further, the reason I include California in this narrative of Latin America is because, for all practical reasons, and I will expand on this as we go further on, California has always been, since the first Spanish explorers in the 1540s stumbled upon this land, and even before then, has always been part of Latin America. And all we have to do is reflect on the name of California, or even reflect on the name of this beautiful town, Santa Rosa. And we know that we are in fact linked indelibly with the history and the fate of the rest of this continent. And I want you to ponder that today and in the future. And although at that time, perhaps, because one of the things that Márquez reflects on is that we didn't have a new method of narrating our reality. And it has taken not just Gabo, but other great writers like Carlos Fuentes, Octavio Paz, Isabel Allende, Mario Vargas Llosa, and so many others to be able to synthesize what it is to be a Latin American. And I may expand that because the same conflict of perception that is prevalent throughout Latin America is equally prevalent in other parts of the world, like the Middle East, like in Asia, and in Africa. And so one of the first things I think that needs to be reevaluated is this perception that Latin America is somebody's backyard. Latin America is actually nobody's backyard. And a better way, perhaps, to think about that is that we are neighbors. And part of what has happened is, as another great writer, Eduardo Galeano, many times pointed out, that in the quest, the European quest, beginning with Columbus, who was really here for gold, as he mentions in his own diaries, is that the richness of Latin America, even to this present day, has served not to enrich our countries, not to enrich our people, but to make other people wealthy. And we see that same sad reality 35 years after Gabo delivered that talk in Stockholm, that not only has it continued to impoverish us, but to this very day, in places like Honduras, where the rivers of Honduras are not to serve the people of Honduras, but to provide life to the people of Honduras, but to provide hydroelectric energy for foreign mining companies that now are destroying Honduras. And most recently, a few weeks ago, the assassination of Berta Cáceres, a Lenca indigenous woman, and that these crimes still exist in Latin America deep into the 21st century has to be a shock and a reminder to all of us that in fact things have not changed, and in fact, like the repetitive cycles that appear over and over again in 100 Years of Solitude, the same history of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and into the 21st century seems to be repeating over and over again in an endless cycle of violence and misery for our continent. And because we are deep into the 21st century, it is important, as Gabo also points out, right, that we do deserve a right to our own destiny, and not only a right to our own destiny, but a right to our own mistakes, because in many ways, we are still a young continent. Mexico, for example, and most of Latin America has not even achieved 200 years of independence from colonial power. And he compares it, compare it to Europe, where Rome took 2,000 years to become established, right? Where Britain took 600 years to build its first major city. So why is it that in Europe and in the United States, errors of history, of development are permissible, and rightly so, but those errors are denied to the continent of Latin America? And he also goes on to point out, and I think it's a fair perception, because not only was Gabo a great novelist, he started his career as a journalist. So he knows how to draw facts out, how to do research, how to add the details to make the story vivid. And we can see that same conflict developing all through the 1980s in places like El Salvador, and even now in the present era in places like Bolivia, where they are not allowed to become who they should be and what destiny permits them to be. Instead, we are forced to be poor copies of the Western world. And so, and part of the debate, unfortunately, and I never tire of pointing this out, that although the debate started with Columbus back after he returned to Spain and after many other voyagers came here to the Americas, the debate somehow still goes on. The debate that was held in the cities of Spain in the 1500s, are the natives of the Americas human? It's an important philosophical question that, in fact, no one yet has dared declare that the indigenous people of the Americas are human, which is why the genocide of the indigenous people of the Americas that has reached over 100 million people in the past centuries is totally ignored, because look around you. Where is the monument to that genocide? Where is the remembrance to that genocide? And even as we sit here in the comfort of this auditorium, in the comfort of Santa Rosa, as I mentioned before, the assassination of Berta Cáceres 2 weeks ago, an indigenous Lenca woman who was fighting for environmental rights. And I will link that story of Honduras to our present political system in a few minutes. And it's not just the assassination of Berta Cáceres, but the destruction of indigenous communities like the Awa in Brazil, communities that up to now have had minimal, if perhaps no contact at all with the Western world, are right now being deprived of their homelands. And again, the genocide continues, because it seems that in spite of the incredible power and impact that Cien Años de Soledad had, not just on this continent, but throughout the world, its basic lessons of humanity, right, and love, if I may say that as well, have not truly been absorbed by those who most deserve to absorb it. And at the same time, one of the fabulous things of Cien Años de Soledad is this, that although politicians in the United States have not read that book, and perhaps not even heard of it, they have adapted the characteristics of some of its characters, like Coronel Aureliano Buendía, and furthermore, they have adapted the narrative techniques developed by writers, like Gabriel Garcia Márquez, which is known as magical realism. But Márquez himself says, I'm not a magical realist. Everything that I write about is based on my reality and what I know intimately. And in fact, he prefers to call himself a supra-realist, meaning he takes reality and just maybe perhaps expands it. And even, I know you're all wondering, because some of you have read 100 Years of Solitude, how is it possible that the story of Remedios, who flies up to heaven with a sheet, could be based on reality? But if you've read interviews with Gabo, he points this out, that in his hometown of Macondo, one spring day, a girl eloped, vanished from the town. Her family, so embarrassed by that incident, came up with a story which they told with a straight face to the villagers, that she had been swept away while she was hanging the sheets. And if you read carefully that section where she goes up to heaven and Fernanda's rant about her, you will see the grain of that story that, yeah, you had to kind of make up. But in fact, it's based on his own sort of reality in that sense. And let me tell you how it is that politicians in this country have adopted the character of Coronel Aureliano Buendía without even having read the book. If you are familiar with the story, you know that in the end, the colonel realized, and Ursula, his mom, realized that he was a cynic about those 32 revolutions. And you might remember that he had drawn a circle of 10 feet with a chalk around him, a circle that nobody could penetrate. Remember those scenes? Now let's apply it to our own world in the United States. We had a president, the previous president, who not only had a circle around him of security, but it was a circle a mile wide in which no one, and you can look it up yourself, because everything I say today, just like Gabo's remarks, are based on reality. They're reality that I have lived and the reality that we all have lived, without understanding that in many ways we are living in our own magical realism reality. And so we had that president who was cynical beyond words, with a circle of security a mile wide, much grander than anything Gabo could have thought up. And even more recently, President Obama's visit to Cuba. I could not help but hear, because it has to be cynicism, because irony is lost. One of the things we've lost in the United States, the sense of irony. But irony is, in fact, the most powerful literary device a writer has. And so Mr. Obama in Cuba, in all cynicism, talking about human rights, accusing the Cubans of some sort of human rights violation, while Mr. Obama is standing an hour away from a concentration camp called Guantanamo, in which there's torture every day. But he seems not to know that part of history. And further on, in his visit to Argentina, notice that he kind of arrives as some of the new conquistadores, because the new conquistadores did not bring a sword and a cross, but they come as multinationals and hedge fund managers, the black-frocked lawyers that appear to Colonel Aureliano Buendia so many times, confusing the reasons why he had launched 32 revolutions. And he made this remark in Argentina. And notice, he didn't go visit the first indigenous president in the history of Bolivia, Evo Morales. And he further, even before that, had turned his back on another African American president that he should have extended a hand of friendship to. And I'm talking about Hugo Chavez. Instead, he goes to collect the debt of the hedge funds that have ruined not just Greece, not just Puerto Rico, but Argentina as well. And he makes the remark that I will wait eternally for him to do it, that he would release and declassify the papers of the United States involvement in the dirty wars in Argentina. But we already know that story because we lived through it. We know the story of the Condor Plan. We know the story of how the Naval Mechanics Institute in Argentina was torture university with the professors, CIA agents, and psychiatrists, where all the most advanced forms of torture were developed, including electrodes to the body and waterboarding, all the techniques that would later be used and implemented in Guantanamo. So we don't really need him to declassify those documents because we already know the story. Clara Nieto, in her great book, Masters of War, Greg Grandin, in his incredible work, Empire's Workshop, have already detailed for us with documents what the United States has been doing these past 50-some years all over Latin America, including in El Salvador, where it was a very deliberate policy to go, quote unquote, primitive on the people of El Salvador, meaning let's become as violent and as crazy and as savage as possible to break the spirit of the Salvadorian people. And so you had questions like new vocabulary. The word disappeared, desaparecido. That word did not exist before. That word perhaps didn't even exist during the time that Gabo gave that speech in 1982. We have, and you can read great novels like One Day a Life by Manuel Argueta that show the brutality, the beheading of campesinos, right? The thrashing of the houses of the women, the forced exile of 1/10 of the population of El Salvador. And so what happened, as Gabo so brilliantly pointed out, instead of El Salvador achieving its destiny and its fate, its history was totally distorted. And now El Salvador is a distortion of what it wanted to be. And just like El Salvador was changed by those brutal wars, the United States has also been changed because now 1/10 of the population of El Salvador lives in the United States, changing forever what the United States will be in the future. And furthermore, we also, here in the United States, just like in Macondo, just in the insomnia plague that destroyed their memory, we also suffer from an insomnia plague that has distorted and destroyed our historical memory, so that what happened yesterday is completely forgotten and is repeated again today and will be repeated again tomorrow in this endless cycle of repetitions. And let me just bring you up to date on some of those repetitions. Our very own President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton overthrew the democratically elected government of Honduras, forced the President Zelaya out of the country at midnight in his pajamas. Now that is something that a future novelist will include in their stories. And critics will say, my goodness, that's so outlandish. That could never have happened. But in fact, it did happen. And it converted Honduras into the most violent country in the world. More violent than Iraq, than Afghanistan, than West Oakland, or the Mission District. And here's the forgetfulness of history. Because I compare the overthrow of these governments to setting a house on fire. And of course, when the people fled Honduras, fled their house that had been set on fire, when 50,000 Central American kids, because it's not just Honduras, it's also Guatemala, that has been set on fire back in 1954 in the overthrow of that democratically elected government, and El Salvador, where we funded such brutal death squads that they would even assassinate the archbishop in the middle of his mass, that they would assassinate 4 North American nuns, that they would assassinate 6 Jesuit priests along with their housekeeper and her 14-year-old daughter. These things are immediately forgotten. And so when 50,000 kids arrived at the border last summer, fleeing those houses set on fire by the United States, it was Secretary Clinton that demanded that those kids be sent back into that fire. Yeah? And in another sort of act that would have astounded even Gabriel Márquez, our own President Obama, who was elected by the Latino population, turned around and deported 400,000 Latinos a year in the greatest forced migration in the history of humankind. And let me point this out, that every president in my lifetime has overthrown a government of Latin America or assassinated a political leader or invaded a Latin American country, and sometimes all of those and at the same time. And yet, as Garcia Márquez also says, and many other Latin American writers also say, that in spite of this horrendous history, it is beautiful to be a Latin American, and that instead of death, we do embrace life. And so what we offer to you and also to the politicians of this country is not violence, because not one Latin American country has ever invaded the United States. Not one Latin American country has ever committed an act of terror in the United States. And so it seems that, tragically enough, 35 years after this great novelist pointed out these facts, it seems like nothing has changed. And we are still looked upon as perhaps not quite human, or almost human, or perhaps they see us all with the tail of a pig. And so, as I mentioned, these cycles going on repeating, and here's where the narrative has been adapted so effectively by politicians in this country. You see, the technique of magical realism is this: to say the most outrageous, outlandish things in a perfectly natural tone of voice. In fact, Gabo mentions that he learned that technique from his aunt, and it wasn't until he heard her voice talking to him again on a road. He was taking a trip to Acapulco. When he heard that voice again, because he had had a writer's block for years, he hadn't written. In fact, he had stopped writing and had wanted to become a scriptwriter to work with the films. He heard that voice. He was on his way to Acapulco, stopped the car, turned around, drove back to Mexico City, and told his wife, Mercedes, you take care of everything, and I'm going to write this book. And she had to sell the car, couldn't figure out how to pay the rent for 16 months. And if you look at the dedication to 100 Years of Solitude, you will find two names that are in fact Basque, and he dedicates the book to his landlords who gave him free rent for those 16 months that he was working on 100 Years of Solitude. But here's how politicians have adapted that narrative technique that I had just described. I'll give you just one concrete example because the day is not long enough to give you all. But about 14 years ago, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice wrote the great magical realist narrative of the 21st century, in which incredible weapons of mass destruction, right out of 100 Years of Solitude, Jose Arcadio Buendia's giant magnifying glass, remember that? To create solar war, appeared before the eyes of Condoleezza Rice and appeared before the eyes of President Bush. And yet, when inspectors on the ground in Iraq searched desperately, even searched Saddam Hussein's palace and even searched his toilet room, this is true, they could not find no weapons of mass destruction. So I always say that Condoleezza Rice should have received the Nobel Prize for Literature for a great narrative in that sense. And also, notice how magical realism is in our everyday life, right? In our country now, corporations are people. That means they get up in the morning, like you and I, they go have lunch, and then they take a shit. And that's something that not even Gabriel Garcia Márquez would have dared put in his own magical realist narrative. And yet we live within that magical realism, that same extended reality, that same dual reality of Latin America without realizing it. And so let me shift briefly to the question of California. Because sometime in the early 1500s, because we don't know the exact date because that first edition has been lost, an incredibly imaginative Catalan by the name of Garci Ordóñez de Montalvo first described a beautiful black queen who lived on a hallucinatory island in which everything was made of gold. And when the first Spanish explorers in the 1530s were just starting to sail north from Mexico, searching for this mythical island of this black queen, they stumbled upon the peninsula of Baja. And since their maps were primitive, they thought that that peninsula was the land of the black queen known as Calafia. And therefore, this must be the land called California. So California existed in the imagination way before it existed on any map. And ever since then, as I mentioned earlier, our history, our worldview has been linked to Latin America. And just like Gabo mentioning that part of the difficulty of Latin America was discovering the techniques to be able to capture this dual reality, a reality of the indigenous people, of the people of the Americas, blended with the reality and the science of Europe, we have been struggling perhaps in a way to define who we are as Californians. And although we have produced great novelists, John Steinbeck amongst many, 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 none of them, I think, yet have been able to capture that magical essence of what California is. And they may not be able to capture that magical essence until they develop perhaps new techniques or new methods of magical realism. And let me point out some of the similarities. Just like the first Europeans, the first Spaniards were driven by a gold fever to invade the Americas, California also has its own gold fever in 1848. And in fact, one of the mythical figures, El Dorado, a city made all of gold, was supposed to have been somewhere in California. And just like, because if you've read the work of Garcia Márquez, in almost every one of his books, there is the mention of the pirate Francis Drake, including in 100 Years of Solitude, because that's what begins that whole lineage of the Buendia family. And let me just point out that Francis Drake also landed along our coast. And not only that, but we've had other pirates, French pirates, in the 1818 or so, sacked Monterey and sacked Santa Barbara. So we also have that link. And who can deny, for example, the many sightings and visions of the Virgen de Guadalupe in places like skyscrapers on the windows of Los Angeles, or even more recently, her apparition in an oak tree in Pinto Lake County Park by San Jose, a site I visited once, and it was like something out of Macondo with dollar bills and medals and prayers offered to the Virgen in that, or who can deny the history of that city that makes nothing but illusions known as Hollywood. So, yes, I do believe, and I hate to be the one to bring you the news, that yes, California history is linked to Latin America, and it is not linked to New England at all. So, in some ways, all of us in this room are Latin Americans. And I want to close by reading the last sentence of his speech that he gave in 1982 in Stockholm upon being awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. If I were not fully aware that the colossal tragedy William Faulkner refused to recognize 32 years ago is now, for the first time since the beginning of humanity, nothing more than a simple scientific possibility, meaning the extermination of the human race. Faced with this awesome reality that must have seemed a mere utopia through all of human time, we, the inventors of tales, who will believe anything, feel entitled to believe that it is not yet too late to engage in the creation of the opposite utopia, a new and sweeping utopia of life where no one will be able to decide for others how they die, where love will prove true and happiness be possible, and where the races condemned to 100 years of solitude will have, at last and forever, a second opportunity on earth. And I hope that we, as humans of this continent, will still have that hope to survive at least another 100 years. Thank you. And I know they've asked me to take questions, but it's not questions really that I'm interested in, because all great books provide us questions. I would much more prefer to hear from you some answers. But I will take questions if you have some. Yes.
I think you'd be remiss by not mentioning about the film that was based on one of your short stories and the fact that it's playing in San Francisco this Saturday.
Okay, thanks for that reminder, Adrian. So I wrote a story many years ago, which also seems to be magical realism. A story called The Other Barrio, based on a horrific fire that happened in the Mission District at the Gartland Apartments in the mid-'70s. And I published that story about 6-7 years ago, based on that fire, fictionalized account. When that story was first published, another fire happened in the Mission District, not as big, but many people were displaced and one person died. In the Gartland fire, 12 people died. A week before the film The Other Barrio, it's a full-length feature, premiered at the San Francisco Independent Film Festival at the Bravo Theater. A week before it premiered, a huge fire, 22nd and Mission, destroyed the housing of 60 Latinos, and one young Latino also died. And during the filming of The Other Barrio, another fire happened, and if you see the movie, you'll see the big burned out building in the background. We didn't have the money to build that set. We used an actual building that had burned in the Mission during the filming. So it seems that any mention of The Other Barrio, that film, seems to spark fires somewhere. So if you do go see it this Saturday night at the Roxy Theater, I hope you come safely home and there's no fires. Yes.
Can you say something about the banana company's
Yes.
attitude towards the workers that they massacred and how that works with super realism?
And Márquez has often pointed out that incredible scene of the 3,000 dead banana workers whose bodies are dumped into the sea, and afterwards, and this is typical of Latin America, right? The response is, it never happened. Nothing ever happens in Macondo, never has and never will. Which is similar, by the way, and not only is it vividly described the lives of the banana workers, but their demands for better working conditions, or how the banana company claims that they do not exist because they're not under contract. It's similar to what corporations still do, right? The workers don't exist. They're not under contract. There's no paychecks for them, yes? And in fact, it's also somewhat similar, I think, to Secretary of State Clinton's response to Honduras. It never happened. There's no such thing, right? But the proof is that 50,000 kids were on the border, yeah? So it's typical of how history gets erased in Latin America. The most horrific events, who remembers anymore what happened in El Salvador and 90,000 dead? Who remembers anymore the 300,000 dead in Guatemala from the coup of 1954? So, although it seems to be magical realism, as he has always said, Cien Años de Soledad is based on strict reality.